few seconds for everybody else to join the webinar this afternoon, so just bear with us as the numbers start creeping up. Well, hi everyone. Hello and welcome to IBA's webinar called All You Need to Know About Engine Values in 2021. Phil Seymour here, Company President at IBA. Thanks for joining us today. As we sit here 1 year on from the World Health Organization announcing that COVID-19 was indeed a pandemic, we've seen the engine sector across all of the industries from OEM, MRO, lessors have all taken a hit from the reduced utilization. For the engine OEM business model, it's a double hit, reduced engine sales and reduced aftermarket sales. And we've seen Rolls-Royce's results for last year being almost 4 billion loss. So it is a bit of an issue. We still look at air freight though as perhaps being a bit of a glimmer of hope over the last year. So I'm joined today by David Archer and Jamie Davey to deliver the session. David is a candidate ISTAT appraiser, so we wish him well in the examination process. We're about to take a detailed look at IBA's engine value changes, the driving forces and justification for these changes, and a look at what to expect in 2021. And that's for engines across all sectors, narrowbody, widebody, and the regional and turboprop sector. So a quick reminder that we provide a range of intelligence products and services to support the industry. And we've been doing this through the aviation cycle, the ups and downs, for 33 years. From our Insight IQ data products, valuations, advisory and analytics through to the technical and asset management side. If you're not familiar with the appraiser services, we've got 6 ISTAT certified appraisers, 5 of which are senior and above. We've been voted Appraiser of the Year twice in the last 3 years, and we've carried out over 3,500 engine valuations in 2020, and we're appointed to most mainstream lessor and bank panels. Our ISTAT team is the powerhouse for the values modules in our data intelligence platform, Insight IQ. In particular, I do want to mention Insight IQ. It's our one-stop aviation intelligence platform, and we recognise the importance of both comprehensive and accurate data. And as such, we apply over 50+ quality assurance steps to every entry update. Our data stems from over 65 years of proprietary data, which we combine with third-party sources and our award-winning valuations team to create the leading aviation data platform. We continue to innovate and provide more development across that platform, news, analysis and insight with technology to provide clarity and solutions to meet your company ambitions. We've recently added more macroeconomic data and events to the trends module, historical values, and we're launching our carbon emission calculator in the coming days. I do want to mention a little bit about that because we're almost ready to go. And I really want to emphasize this is a truly independent carbon emission calculator. It's a combination of the team's technical experience that we have from the airline level. There's many of us have worked at the airlines. It means we've taken various data points from the OEMs, the ICAO figures, plus we've used real flight planning and pilot provided data to create an independent starting point. We know that fuel burn is a complex subject, much in the same way aircraft and engine valuations are, but we're proud to stand by our figures and methodology. In terms of the valuation methodology, I want to make sure that our values and lease rates are actually derived, and the process is shown here. The values and lease rates you're going to see today are the result of the efforts of the engine valuation team, the senior asset management and advisory specialists at IBA, who are actively involved in the management and marketing of engines. We do remarket engines as well as value them. So we do have real hands-on experience. So as well as the data points we collect and collate via public and professional confidential sources, we do discuss every data point to make sure we normalize it so that we can cleanse and provide an accurate and relevant base value, market value, soft value, and the lease rates. We've got 15 content slides to run through today. Rather than wait till the end to address your questions, I will try and introduce those in a sort of informal and chatty style as we go through today. So you will see me asking David and Jamie a few questions as we go along. So because we have had many questions in advance, thanks very much for those. We'll either be responding directly to you or we've included responses within the slide deck. So thanks for those, but you do also have the opportunity to ask us questions as we run through the session, please do that via the questions link on the control panel, and we'll look to address those where we can. We have reached the 1,000 mark in terms of people registering for this session. We've got almost 150 delegates from airlines and over 550 from the leasing and finance community, as we normally expect, plus obviously a fair sprinkling from the OEM, MRO, law firms and other accounting and audit professionals. We've got a couple of polling questions to add if we have time to keep you all involved. But now I really want to hand over to the main deck. David, over to you, please.
Thanks, Phil. So to start off with, I want to give kind of a market overview and a summary of some of the points we're going to touch on today. I think to start with, probably the most important factor that's going to drive any kind of recovery in the market from what we're seeing right now is going to be based around vaccines. We're seeing a large number of vaccines coming from various nations with various levels of distribution and effectivity, but we're seeing very strong growth on that side. That's an excellent side towards the first step towards recovery at the very least. If we look at the nations so far that have been doing the best, we have Israel, UAE, the UK, so two pretty important international transport hubs, and after that we have the United States and Chile. Now, the one standout here is going to be the United States with a pretty substantial domestic market. That's going to be one of the first large-scale domestic markets that we hope to see signs of recovery within, whereas the UK being vaccinated and COVID-free still has limitations on where we can travel internationally. So there are signs in the US already, some feedback from lessors that we're making the first kind of baby steps in that direction, at least. Some material that's been on the ground for some time has started to move again. So very early signs, but that's a positive there. Obviously, they've kept flying through a lot of the outbreak with low load factors. They've kept that utilization up, and there's been some appetite for the engines still in there. If we come to kind of the reality of what's going on in the market, though, we are still looking at very distressed transactions in general. The majority of trades we're seeing are around part-out engines, at which point we're commonly seeing values around 50% of where we were prior to lockdown. But we're seeing sale and leasebacks, where there's still discounts, but largely focused around newer next-generation engines, whereby the values have been derived largely by list price. The small volume of trades that we are seeing around mature assets, again, reiterating what we said previously, mature narrow bodies, the expectations are around about a 30% discount of where we were previously, and for wide bodies as much as 50%. So a very, very soft market there. Otherwise, a focus on short-term leasing. The lessors working very hard with their clients, and some very soft rates that we're seeing there. Otherwise, in terms of general sentiment, I think we are beginning to see a movement in a positive direction. It's been doom and gloom for quite some time now, and we're starting to see a bit more in the way of long-term positive thinking rather than having to react to what's going on in the market. We are, as I said, in the US, seeing very, very early signs, small steps in the right direction of lease being picked up. Sale and leaseback activity, that is expected to pick up fairly soon as airline cash reserves are continuing to be depleted. That will be an area where we see some sales to the leasing market. And on that new generation equipment, I'll just restate that a lot of competition there, lots of lessors looking into that space. That's one positive area, along with the freighter market, which has been, a bit of an upset to expectations. Some mature engines, they're doing fantastic, though potentially, signs of that beginning to soften in some areas at the very least. We also have OEMs now beginning to project their forecast production rates, which are showing, a way out of the decline in production that we've seen for some time. But I think one of the areas I wanted to focus on, and pretty brings us into our next slide, is going to be around MRO demand. If we can move on to the next slide. So just starting on what we've seen so far, shop visit demand, the feedback through 2020 compared to 2019 has been that full scope shop visits are down to around about 30% of what we were in 2019. Now, take into account that factors in Q1 and somewhat Q2, relatively normal expectations there in terms of the number of engines that were going through the shop. It was the end of last year that really dropped off. Perhaps we see that lower slightly through to 2021 relative to 2019. This is, but again, that is to be seen. The real behaviour that we're looking at here comes from this chart on the right, which comes from our Insight IQ database, where we're looking here at the global fleet flight hour utilization on a month-to-month basis and what we've seen. I'm sure this is a chart that many of you are familiar with. That initial decline around March, around this time last year, which did see some recovery, but really since that time it's largely been a plateau. Now, maintenance demand and utilization do go hand in hand when we're in a normal, stable market, and we expect long-term utilization will drive maintenance demand, obviously. But we are seeing a shift to green time engine leasing, a move of lessors and appraisers away from maintenance investment. So whilst this utilization continues at a low level, maintenance demand remains flat, perhaps slightly lower than what we saw in 2020, and we expect the recovery to be some time from now, unfortunately. In terms of what we expect from MRO capacity and how that will recover, there's going to be a lag there, as mentioned. That comes in part from the shift towards green time leasing, at which point after that we start to see the material being removed from the market, what life is remaining removed from the market. At that point, with utilization picking up, we should see lease rates picking up, and from there on, we see maintenance demand picking up, and then eventually maintenance capacity picking up to match that. Right now, the focus is more so around lower scope shop visits in order to boost revenue, lease returns, hospital visits to try and mitigate expensive shop visit costs and keep the engines flying. I suppose one caveat to this would be newer engines, particularly in the wide body market, but also newer generation narrowbody engines where, powered by the hour agreements with the OEMs are collecting the reserves as it is. There's no real benefit in not putting those engines through the shop, and we have seen a fair volume of those going through the shop. So that has been somewhat of a saving grace for some of the MROs and some of the OEM MRO shops as well. In terms of positives that we can take away from all of this, we are starting to see, in some cases, capacity matching up to demand. The V25 market is an example of this, where ADs are driving some earlier shop visits than were expected, and we are seeing lead times through to about June now to get an engine into the shop. So that's the first case where we're seeing capacity match up to demand. So MROs have done a very good job here. I'm sure that there's more to be done to get that balanced out and to keep these lower scope visits going through in the meantime. That is something to take away. Otherwise, long term, inevitably maintenance demand will come back. The question is how long, and that really feeds back into the vaccines, back into utilization demand, international borders opening up. So a lot of variables there that can slow that recovery. But to restate, this is going to be a slow and steady recovery. And if we move on to this next slide, we can kind of see how we're projecting this as it stands right now. Now this is produced again from our IQ Insights data. We're looking here at historic utilization for different MSNs, so on an MSN basis, what airlines are flying with, what environments are flying in, what thrust the engines are at, what variants, a whole list of factors taking in here. The lighter blue area at the back of this chart, there what we're looking at is pre-COVID, what was our projection of shop visit demand? And obviously it was pretty consistent across the board, growth was projected. Obviously 2020 came and that threw that largely out the window, but the demand long-term should still be there. The questions remain, how close did we get in our analysis to what we're seeing right now, and what changes might we see and how this shapes up over time. So we have these three views, these three trend lines that go through the map, across the chart. These aren't meant to be, number for number, how many shop visits we expect per year. It's a trend line long term. The first facts we look in there in that table at the bottom is the severity of the MRO drop. And based on the feedback we've mentioned already, around that 30% drop in full scope shop visits, just to reiterate, we're looking at performance restoration, gas path restoration shop visits here, how severe that drop was. And we have come down around about 30%, which ties in well with our high to severe, so our mid and a more pessimistic view. That's the first stage. The second being the time for recovery in utilization. Again, the vaccine deployment is the key factor here. When will we see utilization pick up in the market? And again, it's that 2 to 4 year range that seems to be, 3 to 4 year range that seems to be the most likely, with MRO demand lagging behind that slightly. The next factor, again, capacity recovery within the MRO market. Will this be in line with demand? Will this lag behind, and by how much? Perhaps we'll see something more of an S curve in recovery rather than a steady increasing line. Obviously, a lot of skilled labour has now had to exit that market for the time being, at least. It's not going to be a case of flicking a switch and coming back to 2019 capacity levels. So there will be some lag there. And the last factor really, which is probably the biggest question mark, is how many of these shop visits aren't going to occur. Obviously, when we're talking about new generation engines, there's very little concern there. When we're talking about an engine on its first run, particularly in the narrow-body market, again, fairly little concern that those engines should continue to be put through the shop and see good utilization, particularly with the deferrals that we're seeing on new generation orders. That should, see a lot of these very reliable engines that are very well understood continue to operate for some time. But there are concerns once we get to third run engines and fourth run engines. Will these engines see another shop visit? Obviously, they're going to shift towards a green time model in the meantime. We're going to see more part outs, more material come to the market. There will be a first mover benefit in terms of passing your engine out earlier rather than when we see a surplus of material. So a lot of variables to take into account there. It's very hard to say, but clearly some of these engines are not going to see their long-term shop visits come to fruition at later stages in life. And regardless of all of these do see a spike above 2019 levels in the long term, it's hard to say where exactly we're going to come out, but it seems like the view 2 to view 3, so that the mid-level to the more pessimistic view seems to be the most realistic, to be honest. On to oh, sorry, we have a polling question here, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Actually, we'll go through the polling question, but I've got some questions on that graphic as well, David, because I think we could almost talk all day about that shop visit projection. But I think the question we really want to ask you all today is, do you expect shop visits to see reduced work scopes rather than full refurbishments? We've only given you the choice of yes or no, rather than don't know or too early to tell. So we just really want to see if you'll be willing to do the simple yes or no option on this one. So we'll give you a few seconds to respond to that before the response comes up. But I think, David, compared to where we were last year, let's talk about this as it's come in. Yeah, I think this is a fairly logical response, isn't it, in terms of that, what I would call cash preservation. I think the issue here is whether there is really a choice, because I would imagine, and I'm going back to my days in the engine management department of an airline in the past, where we weren't under any power by the hour or long-term agreements. We were really managing our engines on a time and materials basis, and it was, clearly if you wanted to save cash, you could just reduce the work scope. But there are so many airlines that are tied in with long-term contracts, and of course with aircraft leases, you've got various obligations in terms of what qualifies. So whilst I think the sentiment would be to reduce the work scope, I think this is going to be an area that's going to be discussed with current work scopes and future over the next year or so, as to how those work scopes could be reduced. I mean, David, you did refer to that, and I think the graph we just showed, the previous slide, we haven't really changed that over the last 6 months, have we? We're still not seeing whether it's really going to be curve, view 1, 2, or 3. We're still waiting, aren't we?
No, I think that the one change that I would want to make to this chart is that through to 2021, I think the expectation should be that we're going to see a flat line. Now, these are just long-term trend lines. As I said, these are meant to represent that 2021 we see a marked jump in shop visits. We don't know the shape of the recovery, but clearly through 2021, that's going to be fairly flat. Late summer 2021, maybe we'll see utilization picking up, but still maintenance demand for the next 2, maybe even 3 years is going to be heavily softened from where we were previously. And that's across the board from anybody that we speak to. The one exception, of course, being engines that are tied into these power by the hour agreements with the OEMs. Utilization is down, so there is less throughput, but they're still going through the shop.
Yeah, and I think shops which have a variation in their capabilities, if they can overhaul CFMs and CF6s and Pratt and Whitneys, and it might be few and far between, but the shops that have the flexibility rather than the captive OEM shops have clearly got a lot more flexibility. I think we saw one engine MRO last week say they were kind of pleasantly surprised they actually had 80% shop visit inputs last year compared to where they thought they might be at 45-50%. But we don't know the detail there. I suspect a lot of those were going to be repair type shop visits rather than the full refurbishment. So yeah, I think there's still a lot to play out in that sector. Good.
Absolutely.
I suppose we better move on, but I think we've already had a few questions on this already, so I might come back to it. Thanks.
So what is the latest news from the OEMs? So Phil has already touched on the latest news from Rolls-Royce around the £4 billion losses reported for 2020, and I'm sure the other OEMs are suffering as well. Obviously, increased exposure to the wide-body market makes it a little bit tougher right now. But across the board, production is way down through 2020. No big surprise there, I'm sure. CFM, though, reporting their projections of when they do expect to see recovery to 2019 levels, and their suggestion is by 2024. That ties in with a few kind of utilization projections that are out there, including our own. So I think hopefully that's a consensus in the market that we can work towards. Maybe we'll see delays. Again, there's a lot of unknowns that drive behind this, particularly around the vaccines and how it's going to be implemented. But still, the recovery profile is developing slowly. Otherwise, the OEMs have made some pretty great efforts towards dealing with the teething issues, the entry into service issues on a number of engines, like the LEAP 1A, LEAP 1B, GTF, and the Trent 1000. Obviously, a great example there would be the Pratt Whitney on the GTF engines. A lot of teething issues there. A large portfolio, a large fleet to cover as well. They had a lot of control over the spare engines in order to deal with that and mitigate the issues. And they've used this downtime to attack these issues head on, which is great. And hopefully we see, when we come at the other side of this downtime in the cycle, we see these issues being something somewhat in the past at the very least. That is the hope anyway. I'm sure there will still be some issues that carry over, but reduced at the very least. The last point, really, in terms of from the OEM side, is going to be around future developments. I know prior to COVID, a big discussion point was around how green is the market, how sustainable is the market, what's the next stage. We had the likes of Rolls-Royce Ultrafan project, which is a fantastic next step, using that geared turbofan technology and moving that into the wide-body market. But there's still issues around, okay, well, when will the airframe developers develop their next stage so that engine can be applied to? So will we see delays, or will we maybe even see an acceleration into that next phase of aircraft that have been talked about for many years? And there's some issues around that. Obviously, electrically powered aircraft, that's a long way off for any kind of reasonably sized narrow-body or wide-body aircraft. Perhaps some regional options may come up in the next decade or so. Hydrogen power, sustainable aviation fuel as well. These are options that are coming into play, but still, I think that's an interesting discussion point that still needs to play out and see what changes are going to happen there. If we move on to the next slide. So how the lessors are adapting. Obviously, we deal with a lot of the lessors and a lot of their portfolios. We speak with them quite regularly. And this chart on the right really tells the main story of what we're seeing there, which is increased availability. We monitor various publications. Obviously, this doesn't account for every engine that's currently available, but it gives an indication of what is currently being listed as for sale or for lease. Just the narrow-body market, you can see a pretty profound increase there. Lessors are working very hard with their customer base to make these leases work, to mitigate where they can, and make it viable for the airlines. But we're also seeing a shift towards short-term leases with lower tier airlines, poorer credits perhaps than the lessors would have liked to have worked with. And we're also seeing pushback on the likes of no minimum utilization requirements, pushbacks on reserve rates, free shipping in some cases. A lot of areas that previously were almost unthinkable have now become the norm. We'll see how long that continues for. And again, AB steps in the US domestic market have started to show some improvement in this. Not a drastic improvement at all, but the first steps in the right direction for this in terms of a recovery. And that's a good sign for how the rest of the world should develop as these vaccines deploy and as these markets can open up again. Otherwise, in terms of trading activity, volumes very low. Again, these part-out values, core values for a CFM engine of $1 million was unthinkable, 12 to 18 months ago. It's a big change, but otherwise the focus is really shifting towards these sale and leasebacks that are coming to the market, particularly around new generation narrow body engines. Lots and lots of competition there around the GTFs, the LEAP 1A, the LEAP 1B as well. Lots of interest in the market, lots of competition. So that's one of the places that's remained quite healthy and close to list price, and with a lot of lessor retention. Anyway, I think I'm handing over to Jamie now.
While Jamie gets prepared, flexes his muscles and things, could you, we have been asked, and we'll probably come back to this to the main Q&A session, but we were looking there at the lessors. We're seeing some consolidation amongst operating lessors. Well, in particular, the GCAS and AirCap situation. And of course, GCAS is an engine lessor as well as being an aircraft lessor. So I just wonder if that could trigger consolidation amongst the engine lessors. At the moment, they all seem to be, doing their own thing, but I do wonder whether there will be some opportunities. It's probably less fragmented than the aircraft leasing world. I think the pre-COVID count on aircraft operating lessors was over 150. The engine lessor market is a little smaller than that, but yeah, I just think there could be something happening there. I don't know if I'll let you think about that, David, and we'll come back to the main Q&A session. So Jamie, sorry to delay you. Over to you. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks very much. So if we begin on where the fleet has stood during the winter period, it's first of all, it's worth noting that winter 2020 to 21 was always going to be a pretty tough time for everyone in the industry. I mean, especially when it comes to the winter schedule, we've had to battle border closures and quarantine rules, and also lockdowns. So it's meant that there has been quite a significant impact on the load factors, and really quite low load factors across the winter. But saying that, the aircraft fleet, according to our IQ, tells a different story, really. In fact, in June to February, there seems to be more aircraft becoming more active and flying in comparison to being parked and stored. The main thing to notice is the main reason that this is happening is that operators are beginning to realize that it's getting quite pricey having those aircraft parked in long-term storage for a long time. So there are a lot more aircraft flying, albeit very, very, very reduced utilization, most likely just enough to just keep it going and ticking over, really. And even though that the load factors are much lower, there has to be almost that middle line of what is the worst impact, keeping it in storage or keeping the aircraft flying. And then if we look at the right-hand chart, it's just an overview of some of the engine types across the board, and in terms of what percentage are currently in service and what percentage are out of service. The main trend really to follow is that it's the newest generation of engines that are seeing almost 100% of the engines are all in service. So, and then if you look a bit further on towards the more mature engine types, so for example, you've got the 737 Classic, the CFM56-3. There are actually more engines there out of service than there are in service. So it's just good to see that actually, there's still quite a lot in service in comparison to what is out of service at the moment. If we move to the next slide. So if we start on the narrow bodies, I think the biggest news really is the 737 MAX returning to service. And it was the 9th of December 2020. Gol Airlines, based in Brazil, were one of the first airlines to reintroduce the 737 MAX. And you can see on the bottom right-hand side there the number of LEAP 1B engines that are now active. I've done it since November to show that it was 0, but obviously since December realistically. And you can see that as time has gone on, the number of engines have gradually started to increase. Currently, as of March, 168 LEAP 1B engines are currently active, and that's on 84 737 MAX aircraft. And as time does go on, we're going to see a lot more MAX aircraft start to enter service, and any deferred deliveries due to the grounding will also start to be fulfilled as well moving forwards. But on the other side, you do have the current engines. So for example, the CFM56 and the V2500. Production is winding down, or in some cases has indeed stopped. But you can see that there's still a large population of these engines currently in service, and it just shows how successful these engines have been. If you look at what is currently in service, 51% of the current engines are fitted to A320 aircraft, and then 49% are fitted to the 737 next generation aircraft. But obviously, the main reason that so many are in service is mainly, let me try that one again. So one of the benefits that's happened over COVID-19 has been the deferral of shop visits for operators. In some cases, it has been a case that some of the engines just haven't hit the utilization required to go in for their shop visits. And for many others, it's just a case of, well, if they're not flying, there's no point putting them in for their shop visits. It has been reported that 60% of CFM56 engines have not even had their first shop visit yet. So it just goes to show that that despite production now winding down, there's still a good long life left for the current generation of engines. And then if we look at the new generation of engines, the backlogs are still very healthy on there. So the LEAP 1A and the Pratt & Whitney GTS, they've still got plenty of orders left to fulfill, and they will still continue to end service as time goes on. Another thing to note as well is that in terms of the shop visits last year, well, before COVID-19, there was an issue in terms of the amount of shop visit demand in comparison to the amount of spare material on the market. And obviously now that shop visits are being deferred and delayed, and older examples of the CFM56 or the V25s begin to retire, that previous issue won't be an issue further down the line. If we move to the next slide. So it's just a very brief touch on the regional distribution. I just wanted to obviously just repeat what David said earlier on, that aviation recovery is beginning to happen, and we can look towards North America and to Asia Pacific for this one, for the recovery of the narrow-body market, mainly due to the very large domestic markets. So you do have a domestic market in the United States, Canada, and obviously for Asia Pacific, it's mainly China. And interesting fact in terms of Asia Pacific, out of the engines that are active there at the moment, 61% of those engines originate in China. So it's interesting to see that it's the Chinese aviation market that's really propping up Asia Pacific, because bearing in mind that there are still many countries that are still facing quite strict quarantine controls. So the international market just isn't there at the moment. If we move to the next slide. So looking at the narrow body engine values, it's worth noting that we've not really had that much trading data to warrant us changing the base values too much. There's been nothing drastic for us to change those base values, so that's remained pretty stable as time's gone on. But it's the market values where you do see the changes, and it is the older engine variants. So for example, the 7B26, the 5B4Ps, and the V2500 base engine. These older engine variants operators will be more inclined to start retiring these, especially once the newer generation engines really start to come into the market, really. But obviously the newer generation current engines, for example, the 7B26E, the tech insertions, these particular engines still have a lot of life left in them. And again, many of these still haven't had their shop visit, their first shop visit yet. So there's still a long time to go before we even consider thinking anything else on those engines at the moment. In terms of the newer generation, the A320, the Leaps and the GTFs, again, these values remain very stable. Again, there are very minor movements in the market values. Mainly it's just due to the state of the market at the moment, but nothing drastic to be alarmed about, really. And to be honest, we do have a very positive outlook for these engines moving forwards. But obviously, it's worth noting that even though that you've got the MAX coming into service, don't expect to see many 7B engines suddenly. So I'll try and rephrase that properly. So you won't expect to see a surplus of 7Bs available in the market, really, because again, as I've said, because many still haven't had their first shop visit, it's a case of you won't suddenly see values tank on the 7Bs or anything like that. It's still a very decent market to be in at the moment. And yep.
Actually, yeah, Jamie, I think it's probably worth mentioning some of the value definitions here, because it's always a big debate point. We're using the ISTAT definitions here, and these are based on single sale. I mean, in terms of our base values, I don't think we've adjusted any base values because of COVID on these engines, have we? I think these have all been viewed as the long-term economic values, and I'm getting some nods there, so I'll take that as agreement. Obviously, I think some of the market values we have reduced a bit just because of the general market. Are there any engines there that have taken a bigger hit than others?
Mainly it's I would say it's the base, it'd be the base engines. So I would almost say it's the earlier V2500s that are not the select ones. These ones would have taken a bit more of a hit than say the select ones.
Okay. And do our values, does this assume there's a QEC fitted, or is this a bare engine?
No, these are bare.
Okay. Good. And I do think what we do see compared to the ISTAT definition of market value, whenever there's a downturn, the people who are selling engines tend to be in a distressed situation. I mean, it's very unusual for a lessor to suddenly put a load of engines up for sale without any leases attached, because they're long-term players. They've got the experienced teams to ride out the downturns. Because I think what we're seeing across some engine types, we are seeing some very low engine values. We're getting questioned, this engine is way below your market value. Condition is pretty key. Obviously, you can look at it from a point of view of how much time is available on the LLPs and what's the gas path performance like, what's the EGT margin. But of course, it depends on who is buying. If you're selling an engine to a trader, then the trader might take a longer term view. So if a bank or an airline is in a distressed situation, the chances are that you will see a soft value or an ISTAT distress type value coming in. So we know we want to see values. This is how we portrayed our session, but we do emphasize, we make sure you're using the right value in the right context. So, please ask us about values if you've got any questions on these. So yeah, sorry, Jamie, I thought I'd better leap in
no, that's fine.
with a little bit of ISTAT clarity there.
So if we jump to the next slide. So if we move on to the wide body market, and if you look at the bottom chart, it really does outline the winners and losers in the pandemic, really. The older engine types, for example, you've got the Trent 800s, the Pratt & Whitney 4000, 112s and 100s. These particular engines are seeing a lot more of these engines in storage. Obviously, just to note, the red means that they're stored, and obviously green means that they're active. These engines, obviously, operators, you know, they are mature examples. Many operators are really not in any mood to operate these in favor of the more current engines or even the newer generation engines, because obviously, you know, they'll be much more fuel efficient. And obviously, some of them might even be approaching their shop visits, and some just might not want to do it. But obviously, looking towards the right of it, you can see the Airbus A380. I'll only touch on it briefly because that's a whole kettle of fish there. But there's a lot of these engines that are in storage and parked at the moment. And there are going to be questions in the next couple of years in terms of whether or not these A380s will even go through their first shop visits. So that would be something to watch and to see. But at the moment, obviously, it's just very early to tell. In terms of the newer generations, they are pretty much the workhorses of the bunch. So the Gen X's, the Trent 1000s, the XWBs. These particular engines benefit from very healthy backlogs. There's still plenty more orders to be fulfilled. And the main benefit that we've seen from this one is that many of these engines are attached to power by the hour agreements or something very similar along those lines. So it means that it's been quite beneficial to put these engines through their shop visits, because again, it hasn't been because the operators just won't see the cost. It won't cost them heaven and earth to get those engines through in comparison to more mature engine types. Yes, if we move to the next slide. So again, focusing on the values, again, it's worth reiterating, we have seen reduced trading volume throughout the pandemic. If we have seen transactions, again, we have seen a few distressed transactions. So we've had to, I think as Phil's discussed earlier on, it's just a case of trying to think more long term, really. It's the main things to note is that even though the market is indeed weaker, for mature engine types, another route that it might go down is to be converted to freighters. And obviously, we do have a webinar on the freight market. It might be worth having a watch for the context there. But the main thing to note is that even though the engines are more resilient than airframes, we do need to look at what the airframe is doing in terms of how we predict how the engines will work. So, for example, with the A330, it is generally a much softer market. There are much more A330s in storage. Again, there's still plenty active at the moment, but again, there are more, you know, there's certainly more in storage here. And airlines are mulling over what they are going to do with their A330 fleets. KLM, for example, are really deciding if they're going to keep the A330s. American Airlines have already turned around and said, we're not having them. The A330neo is one to watch as well. The market values, there's still a bit of a difference between the base value, but the main thing to note on that one is that, again, the neo still has quite a small operator base and quite a limited backlog as well. So that is going to be something we'll need to watch. The GE90s for the Boeing 777, even though the market value does look a little bit shocking, it's worth noting that there is optimism around this one. The Boeing 777X is still delayed at the moment, so there's still use for the engine at the moment. We're not saying that the engine will go away overnight. That won't be the case, because there is still a very loyal operator base who use those 777s very well. So I think it's the G90 isn't going away overnight. And obviously, finally, the It's the new generations, the Trent XWBs and the Trent 1000s. Again, that is still remaining very strong, and there's still a lot of there's still a good market for these engines moving forwards as well. So very strong. And if we move to the next slide. And finally, we're on to the regional engines. Now, regional engines are a bit different to the rest of the engines we've talked about. It's going to be one of the, we would say it'd be one of the first areas to recover, mainly for two reasons. And one of them is, again, the low load factors that we've seen across the market. I mean, I've personally seen that there have been regional aircraft that are actually doing quite long routes that would usually be done by, say, a 737 next gen, or because again, if the load factors aren't there, it is much easier to fill a smaller aircraft than it is to take a larger aircraft on that same route. And at the same time, there are still public service obligation routes to think about, and there are areas of the world that still very much rely on the essential air service. And realistically, life still goes on for these regional engines. If we look at the regional jet engines as they are, it's the Embraer E-jets that are dominating the market there. You've got the CF34-8E and the CF34-10E. The difference between the two really is the CF34-10E for the Embraer E190 and 95. It's not particularly been favored that much in comparison to the smaller E170 and 175. There are two main things really. It's the high cost of ownership. It is a larger aircraft that are operating on these smaller routes and city pairs. So again, are airlines really bad? You know, are you really going to break even with those aircraft? But the engine value was soft before COVID-19 anyway. But if anything, COVID-19 has almost been the saving grace for this engine type, because again, there's still a need for these regional aircraft at the moment, and there is still competition from the E2, which is obviously Embraer's next aircraft, and the Airbus A220. Very fierce competition, but again, because there's production delays with the E2, that is again a saving grace. But the CF34-8E is still a very strong engine. It has a very loyal operator based mainly in North America, and realistically, you can see between the market value and the base value that there's not really too much of a difference between the two, because again, we feel that the future is going to be very bright for this particular engine type. The CF34-8C, again, even though older examples are beginning to retire, there's no direct replacement for this aircraft at the moment. And obviously we are seeing a softening, but obviously as time goes on, older examples will then begin to retire much more. And we would say it'd be more of a sunset retirement. So it'll be a very nice way to go out. Finally, with the turboprops, in terms of the values remain quite stable with turboprops, so the Pratt & Whitney 120s, 150s, mainly because the value is held in the maintenance value. So that's mainly controlled by MROs and OEMs instead of the core value of the engine. So realistically, the engine values will remain quite stable, and the outlook still remains very positive. There's always a place for regionals and turboprops. And yeah, that's.
Yeah, Jamie, I was going to ask you about that. We had a few questions about some of the costs of that regional and turboprop sector. One of the comments we had was that the actual cost of engine overhauls, particularly on the regional jets, the larger in this sector, rather than the turboprops, some of those engine shop visits are extremely costly. Maybe not quite up there with the V2500 and CFMs, but in terms of if we were to, let's say, look at the engine proportionally to the number of passengers in the aircraft it carries, some of those shop visits are relatively high. So I think this sector for a long time has been asked to sort of face up to some of those operating economics. But I do wonder if, although we've been reasonably positive about the regional sector, that the fact that it should come back relatively quickly as we start to become more mobile, perhaps unlike the long haul travel. I just wonder if there are still some question marks on the operating economics of some of those larger regional jets. I mean, do you know, off the top of your head, do we know typically what we see as the overhaul costs on some of those bigger CF34s?
Not on me, I'm afraid.
Okay. I mean, but I think, you know, that general view is right, that they can be seen as very expensive, and I think the OEMs do need to be looking at how they can offer more flexible shop visits on some of those engine types. I'll let David. David, do you want to run through these the key takeaways here?
Sure, of course. I think the biggest takeaway really is going to be around this chart on the right. Now, this is sourced from BBC. I've seen a number of publications with a similar chart as well. But we're looking here at when will nations be fully vaccinated. Really, that's going to be the biggest driver in terms of utilization pickup, in terms of the use of the remaining green time, and therefore the pickup in maintenance, and returning to a healthy and stable market. It's going to be some time before we see. Clearly, there's going to be some difference in how various countries perform. Some Western nations will likely see you know, a high percentage of vaccination before the end of this year, moving to you know, an increasing number of nations by the end of 2022. You know, much of the developed world, and by early 2023, hopefully a global vaccination. So clearly, there's going to be stages of unlocking the utilization that's in the market. But it's a story kind of that needs to develop further. There are still queries around, could there be another strain that's vaccine resilient, and what kind of level of booster jabs are required as well. But this is going to be the driving force behind everything. Otherwise, in terms of just key takeaways, the market remains very soft, but we are seeing some signs of a positive long-term outlook. That should be the biggest takeaway. Narrowbody markets remain, narrowbody new generation engines remain a very strong market, very attractive market. The freighter market remains quite popular on some of the more mature widebody types, but otherwise, as a whole, the market remains very soft. Limited trading activity, focused more so around sale and leasebacks of more attractive assets and part outs of less attractive assets at fairly significant discounts. And that should really be kind of the core takeaway, is that we remain in a soft market, but we look positively at the future and hope to see trends by the end of this year at least that take us in the right direction towards a recovered market.
Okay. Good. Well, I think we've got quite a few questions that come in. I think we may need to get back to you. A few of you asked some questions about clarifying some of the in-service numbers and how we define those, because we had slide 18 where we were looking at some of the in-service operation, and we've had a few questions about how they correlate to slide 14. Rather than getting stuck into that right now, I think we'll come back to you on that one. I think with, I suppose the one that seemed to be quite shocking was the GE90 values, the market value compared to base. That one seemed to be the biggest difference. Yeah. But we've had a few questions about whether those GE90 engine values may hold up, given that, you know, there's this the panacea of the 777-300ER P2F program, and that perhaps, you know, all is not lost for those for the owners and lessors of those. But that did stand out to me, David, as a big difference. Does that perhaps reflect that we're going to have to look at base values on those engines in the next year?
I mean, so prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, we did review our standpoint on these engines. We did adjust base value based on a reassessment of the long-term future. But really, so far, whilst COVID has been quite negative on this type, and we have seen some very soft trades, long-term view remains the same as where we adjusted to. I think absolutely the freighter market is a great potential for this, but we've seen some great utilization on this type as well throughout the pandemic. The big burden here is obviously the cost of ownership, very high cost of overhaul and LLP material. We've seen shop visit bills in the area of 15 million, not uncommonly, some higher, some potentially lower. And we do see pushback against the OEM in some cases on these, but still our long-term view remains the same. We think with the A330 market suffering so heavily and likely to see some more parts out activity, with the 777X being delayed still, we may see a longer grace period for the type and a stronger position within the market in relative terms. So I think our base value right now remains the same. Obviously, we review these constantly and our position on these. Even our market value now, these are ISET-defined market values, is above where we're seeing some trades, but we do expect to see long-term recovery in this fleet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were asked a question about engines that operate in harsh conditions and whether we adjust values for those engines, given the potential increased shop visit costs for those engines.
Yep.
I mean, in terms of when we provide a valuation through Insight IQ, is that assuming average conditions rather than those operating with a higher severity curve?
Exactly, yeah. Through Insight IQ, those will be the default figures, but any desktop exercise that we carry out, we obviously take into account the operating environment, what thrust the engine has been operated at or continues to be operated at, and also obviously the harshness of the environment. That can definitely increase the cost of the shop visit, and obviously will decrease the intervals that you can possibly achieve on wing, in some of these harsher environments. No question.
Fair enough. I don't know if it's possible to go back to the slide where we had the shop visits. That slide 11, it is, Lucy. If we can go back to that, how long until we see an MRO recovery? It's kind of the slide that keeps on giving, as far as I'm concerned. We were asked a few people have asked questions on here, David, about if we're looking at our projections of the 2019 shop visits. So the pre-COVID view is the solid blue block here. So we've had a couple of questions about, what's the rationale for, view 1 and view 2 actually exceeding those from sort of even 2024 with view 1. So how do we explain that demand could be even higher in the future than we originally expected?
Yeah, the biggest question there is really around how many offset shop visits are we going to see? And in our most optimistic view, we were looking at a fairly small percentage of these offset shop visits not occurring. So obviously that implies that we're going to see a massive deficit in shop visits in the short term, but that has to be filled in somewhere. Obviously, some of these engines will see retirement over the next 10 to 15 years. It's a long term. These will, flatten out to in theory where we were previously, so long as the market doesn't contract. But there has to be a recovery somewhere where these shop visits that were meant to happen in 2020, 2021, they will happen in concurrence with previously projected shop visits. The level of impact of that is up for debate, absolutely, but inevitably we're going to see some stacking of projected shop visits and delayed shop visits.
Yeah, I think that's well, firstly we have had a couple of questions on it, and I think it's one that we're going to have to keep a close eye on. Is that 7B market, the engine that's on the 737NG is really with potentially a lot of those older aircraft retiring. What percentage of our shop visit forecast did we assume they may be going in for third and fourth shop visits? Obviously, Jamie has projected a relatively sustainable market value for those engines. But I think, am I right? I think the answer might be yes, there are quite a few older 737NGs, but you've still got thousands of younger ones which will continue in service. They're not all going to be replaced instantly with Maxes or just be parked forever. Is that a reasonable summary on that?
Yeah, it's not always the first thought, because you look at these fleets and they've been around for quite some time. but the production rates really picked up towards the end of life. And you know, it's a number that gets thrown around a lot, but obviously CFM engines, still 50% of them yet to go through the shop visit. That's a significant number of a very large fleet of engines yet to go through the shop, and it would be quite shocking to see a significant proportion of those not go through that first shop visit. That would be very, very surprising. For the mature examples, absolutely, there are question marks around them. You know, we're looking at the oldest examples, the base 7Bs, and we do provide a value differentiator there. But in terms of how many are going to be retired, you know, we are seeing max order deferrals continue. And it really is going to depend on how we see utilization pick up in the meantime.
One last question, because we have come up to the time limit, but I know that we've still got many hundreds hanging on. A bit of a deeper dive here on the demand and supply in the LLP market, as distinct from, let's say, the broader used engine market. I mean, LLPs, it must be great now, mustn't it? If you're putting an engine through a shop, you must have a lot of availability of some reasonable life LLPs. Is there going to be increased demand there?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen so far, you know, obviously this material is generally going to hold a higher percentage of list price value compared to other material in the engines. And that seems to be in the region of 60 up to maybe even 80% in some engines, which maybe is a bit of a surprise given what's going on with the values of the type. That said, this material from any part out will, at this point in time, will quite likely sit on the shelf for some time until we see an increased volume go to the shop. Absolutely, you can see an increased supply. Maybe we see some softening, but for now, the values have been relatively resilient. Now, prior to COVID, obviously, we're talking 2019 peak market, we were seeing a lot of these LLPs still trading, you know, prorated, but at basically list price. So that is still a pretty significant softening, but they are holding up.
Okay, good. Well, I don't want to outstay our welcome. So I'm now just going to remind you all that we're using data from our online data intelligence platform, Insight IQ. We're offering demonstrations, so do drop us a line or register through the website if you'd like to look at the system. There's also a feedback link, so you can actually request that after this presentation. You can automatically refer to that on the feedback. That might be the quickest and easiest way to get hold of us on that. So we will go back through some of the questions we have. I said there's been some quite detailed ones this afternoon, so I'll be sharing those with David and Jamie, and we'll be getting back to you fairly quickly on those. So do get in touch if there's anything else we can help you with things we've discussed today. So thank you all for attending today's session. You will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to view the recording of today's session and the slide deck. So on behalf of IBA, David, Jamie, and myself, thanks for joining us today, and a special thanks to our marketing team of Melissa, Lucy, Dom, and Abby, who've organised us to get this event to you today. Goodbye.